Freedom, form, life. No sooner are the words invoked than the figure connecting them is drawn and set to motion, triangulating in a kaleidoscope of possibilities. Out of all possible constellations, I allowed myself to follow one of the most obvious, but I hope, therefore, not least propitious, namely, to trace Nancy's major exposition of freedom in the Experience of Freedom from 1988, up to the point where it touches on the minor theme of form in The Pleasure in Drawing from 2009. What this tracing effects is not only to indicate, despite shifts of emphasis and terminological prerogatives, a vector of continuity in Nancy's work across decades and domains, but importantly to draw on life in order to draw life in the wake of Jean-Luc Nancy's passing, which has taken place amidst an entrenched and often embittered contestation of life and freedom, that is, of life against freedom and freedom against life. To make sense of the two in the thick of the cacophony of the touts of each, Nancy's indifference towards the senses of freedom makes for a most conducive beginning. He writes, freedom is also wild freedom, the freedom of indifference, the freedom of choice, availability, the free game, freedom of comportment, of air, of love, of a free time where time begins again. It frees each of these possibilities, each of these notions of freedom, like so many freedoms of freedom, and it is freed from these. Nancy will call for the same freedom, the same annulment of privilege with regard to the senses of love, the senses of sense, and I would say with him, the senses of life. For there are indeed the lives of humans and viruses, as much as the afterlives of the living, the lives of ideas, precarious and bare lives, lives unlived and lives relieved of the burden of life. Life leads numerous lives. 1. Of freedom. To begin then with freedom, a task as foreboding today as 3 decades ago when Jean-Luc Nancy took it up, venturing to think freedom for the first time since Heidegger, not as a merely historic, but as a guiding theme. For Nancy, Heidegger constitutes the last in a lineage of thinkers running through Spinoza, Kant, Schelling, Hegel, who recognize freedom as the fundamental question of philosophy, in which even the question of being has its root. Importantly, as last in this line, Heidegger marks also its interruption, so that Nancy understands his own task as a meditation on an inherited interruption. Retracing this exploration, one first encounters Nancy's encounter with Kant. This sets the stakes of the Heideggerian inheritance under the rubric of 3 major counter premises, 3 major refutations. Firstly, contrary to his explicit postulation, Nancy claims, Kant already gleaned that freedom is not an idea. Freedom is instead an essential fact of existence and of its meaning, the fact of being abandoned to being in the world, and one without which existence is reduced to the fact of mere survival. As such, freedom is, if anything, the force of resistance to the concept or idea of freedom, by default withdrawing when enveloped in an idea. This disarticulation of freedom from its idea is particularly significant for Nancy, as is its postulation as actual force, not least the force that effects this disarticulation. Secondly, contrary to the Kantian free will that wills to constitute itself as both the represented object and representing subject, becoming thereby the most essential property of the subject, Nancy labors to extirpate or expropriate freedom from the subject. Nancy finds in Hegel the first gesture of this expropriation, which shows freedom as the finite exposure to the infinite separation of essence as existence. This expropriation, prepared by Schelling and carried forward by Heidegger, becomes in Nancy equivalent to the subject's originary exposure to infinite difference. Ultimately, Nancy will proclaim freedom as having the exact structure of the subject. What is equated in this equation of subject and freedom is the self-construction and self-appearance of the subject. This is not a vindication of Hegel. The subject makes itself in appearing to itself precisely as incapable of making itself, and vice versa, it appears to itself as making itself in a way that must remain opaque. There is no dialectic and no synthesis here. This subjectum sive libertas, subject or freedom, does not produce a mastery of meaning or sense, but remains naked nothingness. Thirdly, Nancy opposes the equation of freedom with causality or necessity effected by Kant and most of the subsequent tradition. Nancy notes that by laying freedom as the keystone of the architectonic of pure reason, Kant made it impossible to prove the fact of its existence from within the logic of this architecture. The short-circuiting of this logic becomes accordingly apparent in the emergence of freedom as the non-physical cause that inserts itself surreptitiously into a chain of physical causality. From 1929 onwards, Heidegger attempted to extract the notion of freedom from causality, an effort culminating in his 1936 course on Schelling's On the Essence of Human Freedom, where freedom was cast as archifoundation, the Abgrund of human reality. In Schelling, Heidegger discovered the fact of freedom as necessary to human essence, but soon went on to abandon Schelling for failing to consider this freedom as nothing, that is, as a finitude, which an infinite being cannot found. And shortly after, with very little explanation, he would abandon the theme of freedom altogether. In a 1943 seminar note, he offers the scant explanation: freedom forfeited its role originally in the history of being, for being is more original than beingness and subjectivity. Causality and subjectivity, if they still mattered at all, were absorbed by beingness. This is the interruption that Nancy and with him we today still inherit. Its lineaments amount to the dissociation of freedom from its idea, its expropriation from the subject, and its release from causality. This triple freeing of freedom is not merely negative. Freedom is acclaimed as the force of things, the force of the act of existence. Freedom is acclaimed as co-originary with the subject, as the subject's self-difference. At the same time, freedom is acclaimed as the nothingness that founds and supports every act, the effects of which may vary depending on the linking of forces, but which is itself as thing always the same and absolute intensity. As might already be clear, Nancy does not merely pick up where Heidegger left off. The affected interruption is not incidental, but is anticipated by aporias which are integral not only to this interruption, but also already to the logic of freedom that animated a tradition that led up to its own exhaustion. The entwinement, if not identification, of freedom and causality informs one of these aporias. For Kant and much of post-Kantian philosophy, freedom was understood as the enigma of causality that postulated the free will as the cause of its own representation. As caused, the will is here the object of absolute self-knowledge, yet as cause, it is the absolutely incomprehensible, that is absolutely free, subject of self-legislation. The necessary, if inexplicable coincidence of this refraction of the will corresponds to the necessity of the idea. And since the idea is itself a representation of necessity, the law of freedom becomes equivalent to the necessity of necessity. This configuration of freedom as redoubled necessity constitutes for Nancy an expression of theoretical and practical powerlessness. From Rousseau and Kant to Marx and Heidegger, the escape from this double impotence consisted in doubling the stakes on the side of praxis by stretching out freedom, construing it as a passage from theoria to praxis. Despite aligning with and advancing the three aforementioned refutations, Heidegger, in postulating freedom as the most fundamental ontological determination, retained praxis as its domain, even as he replaced the Kantian pure will as the subject's form of legislation with the duty of existence, das Sollen des Daseins. Heidegger remained within the orbit of practical necessity, occluding, according to Nancy, the anarchy of existence, its deliverance from every law unto the fact of freedom. Moreover, and indeed more importantly, this ontologization of praxis under the aegis of freedom, a recoil, as it were, of the practical into the theoretical, amounted for Nancy to a suppression of the distinction between freedom and truth, where this distinction would have to be maintained in order to think, in Nancy's words, together and in the same originarity, the withdrawal of freedom's being and its singular factuality. In another idiom, what would have to remain free is the relation of freedom's essence or quiddity to its existence or hexity, the relation of freedom to itself, its auto-affection. Thus, Nancy will pursue the Heideggerian interruption, which at the very moment of freedom's nearly silent discredit and abandonment, Nancy will pursue the Heideggerian interruption, which at the very moment of freedom's nearly silent discredit and abandonment inserted surreptitiously the free, das Freie. Rejecting the word freedom, Heidegger preserved and promoted its semantic root in order to account for the groundlessness of being and the leap of thought it calls forth. The free became thus the existing opening wherein freedom takes place. It became Heidegger's way of saying Cora. The Cora of freedom is for Nancy the space of experience. Nancy recalls the origin of the word experience in pera and in experiri, which bespeak a lack of foundation that calls for an act of founding on the basis of a perilous experimentation by a subject not in royal command, but undergoing a trial or passion, exposed like a pirate, piratis, who freely tries his luck on the high seas. For freedom cannot be appropriated, but only pirated, illegitimately seized. Nancy asserts that the experience of founding is the essence of experience in general, yet the foundation laid is more or less the nothing itself, this ungraspable Cora, carried to the incandescent intensity of a decision. Said differently, the foundational act decides existence through a piracy that pirates the impropriety and formlessness of a Cora, the Cora of freedom. It is in this sense that freedom is the experience of the limit of peras. The limit one can never reach, yet must nonetheless hold on to. This is then where the inherited interruption has led Nancy. The fact of freedom consists in a self founding itself, not by causing this foundation, but by undergoing the experience of an exposure to its limit, that is, to the nothingness of its existence. Importantly, in this regard, the self does not have the experience of existence, rather, the experience it has is existence. Understanding freedom as an experience of limits, or as liminal existence, is what invites an examination of form. For form is precisely the limit where the formed and the formless mutually touch. As Nancy exclaims, the fever of drawing, the fever of art in general, is born of the frenzied desire to push form right to the limit, to make contact with the formless, as an erotic fever pushes bodies to the limits of their own forms. 2. Of form. To continue then with form, Nancy turns to drawing as a principal practice of form. For in drawing, the form remains open, initiated and incomplete, forever beginning and without closure. The character of drawing as incessant beginning is decisive for Nancy, and it is this character that carries into the aesthetic domain, that is the domain of truth on the surface of sense and affect, the theme of freedom. Recalling the distinction of power and freedom from the experience of freedom makes the purview of drawing and thus of form clearer. Power has an origin, freedom is a beginning. Freedom does not cause coming to being, it is an initiality of being. The drawing of form is freedom insofar as it initiates being. Nancy takes on the objection that drawing initiates a simulacrum rather than being itself by appropriating and undoing Platonism at once. He commits to an understanding of drawing as the designation of the idea precisely in a Platonic sense, the idea as the intelligible model of the real, the visible form of the thing, visible, however, only to the intellect. Drawing proceeds from the desire to show this form, and it is in this sense that it designates, presents, monstrates, or ostentates the idea. However, this presentation of the idea is never mere reproduction. It consists rather in an excess of intention, a tension that allows the form to open itself to its own formation. In drawing, the form draws freedom, it draws life to form itself. Accordingly, Platonic mimesis is also adopted and adapted as what takes hold of and makes evident the formative and rousing force of the idea, the ostension and emotion of truth. Mimesis does not represent the idea, rather it manifests its force. This vouches for the provocation that mimesis is without model, since the forms it procures conform to and make visible the model of the idea only in the sense of truth, which inflects knowledge into pleasure, carrying forth and playing out the formative rather than the formed form, forma formans rather than forma formata. As force, form is dynamis, yet contrary to the Aristotelian definition of the distinction between physis and techne, in which physis has its forming principle within itself, whereas techne receives this principle from the craftsman, form is here a self-forming force. Nancy calls this metastable process a state of formation, status formandi, or birth, status nascendi, a state in which the form as formation of the idea precedes and extends itself, beyond what allows its identification in the present of its presentation. Thus, whereas formed form summons a new formation, the idea makes demands on itself beyond its identifications. Drawing accordingly designs to designate the nascent form whose form is nowhere given in advance. In turn, the forms that drawing and more broadly techne develops constitute a mimesis or imitation of nature only in the sense of the inimitable forming force of a germination or of a reproduction and growth presumed without art, in other words, without artifice, and thus without search or effort. For freedom is apparently without search or effort. Nonetheless, a practice of forms does not know its limits in advance. If it is able to give form to the formless, to make the one touch the other, it is because it touches by surprise its own limit. As such, the freedom of the forming form is without search only in the sense that it does not undertake a programmatic search of a pre-established discovery. The force of the forming form is rather itself constituted as an incessant search of what cannot be known or imagined, what in fact cannot exist before it is found. Ultimately, it is not about showing what does not show or showing that does not show, but rather showing the infinity of becoming visible. As with freedom, this is the actualization of an infinitude, the actual infiniteness of the finite as finite. 3. Of life. To close with life, or perhaps to open with life. In the brief sketch above, the drawing of form was understood as a practice of freedom, one in which the formative force of things reaches its limits and thus forms itself. In that regard, drawing imitates nature, not by representing nature, but by becoming nature, becoming self-forming freedom. Nancy asks himself, would I say that all things are free? He responds immediately, yes, if I knew how to understand this. But at least I know that it would have to be understood. For it becomes soon apparent that unless nature, that is everything, is free, humans cannot be free either. If nature is delivered to causality, Kantianism is bound to return. However, the proclamation that all is free is reached only late in the experience of freedom. Earlier in the work, freedom is directly connected to existence, which is consistently understood as thought. The life of the existent is identically its thought, writes Nancy, making it difficult to escape the illusion of the existent with Dasein. Thus, it is thinking that trembles with freedom, since freedom is a leap and a burst into existence, a leap in which existence is discovered as such. This discovery is thinking. Adjoining the preceding, it appears that the life of the existent, which is thought, consists in existence discovering itself. Or in other words, thought discovering itself, thought thinking itself. A prime mover, forever actual, forever alive. And we know the implications of that with Paul. The classical recoil is, however, recuperated by an internal inflection of thought. The burst of freedom Nancy calls the other thought of all thought. Not the other of thought, nor the thought of the other, but that by which thought thinks. Nancy continues, this other thinking, which frees all thought as such, is not restricted to any definite form of thought. It is perhaps the formlessness of all thought. Freedom is thought only in the sense of the discovery of the cora of thought, of the nothingness that conditions it. This nothingness is, not only to the existent, but to all being, life. In closing this brief exploration, which attempted a cut across three very complex domains, it is worth rehearsing one last time the tension and stakes at hand. Early in the experience of freedom, a line appears that might again have come from Heidegger's hand. Human beings are not born free in the same way that they are born with a brain, yet they are born infinitely to freedom. The choice of a brain is not accidental. Not even the most intimate material substratum of thought is born to freedom. Only thought, the life of the existent, is. Theories of neuroplasticity were in their infancy at the time of the composition of the experience of freedom, the adult brain being thought of as a finished product. But this is not decisive here. What seems decisive is that thought, under the name of existence, makes a something out of a thing, allowing it to be one among many possible singularities that break with the necessary self-enclosed repletion of a material universe. In this sense, Nancy claims phenomena are necessary, the very existence of the thing is free. For it is in thought where the gift of freedom is given, the opening of the world takes place, the simple there is appears. Thus, for Nancy, freedom is not an essence, but the being free of being, where its being is expended. It is its very life, if life is understood as originary auto-affection. But being is not a living being, and it is not affected by its freedom. All this Nancy continues, yeah? Being is only what it is insofar as it is in freedom and as freedom, the being of a bursting of being that delivers being to existence. At this pole, being becomes itself, which means something only in freedom, eo ipso, in thought. However, as mentioned, the attraction of a second pole becomes stronger as the book progresses. Nancy retracts. I have tried to say that we are the freedom of all things. And perhaps this expression should not be kept within our freedom, but rather that freedom of being puts itself at stake as the free existence of the world and as our existence to this freedom, which also means that we are responsible for the freedom of the world. From the onto-epistemological condition of the thing's freedom, the existent becomes its guardian or separate. Accordingly, if anything altogether appears as a phenomenon or to itself a subject, it is not through reason, but through its own free coming. If freedom is the other thought of thought as well as its condition, it is already free and already being, perhaps already life. Accordingly, one can see existence taking place on the surface of things decided by a clinamen, which is not chance, but the free opening of the there is in general, that is, each time. And thus Nancy can write, in this sense, the stone is free, which means that there is in the stone, or rather as it, this freedom of being that being is, in which freedom as a fact of reason is what is put at stake according to co-belonging. The stone is free. The enigma of this utterance is, I believe, the profound inheritance of Nancy's meditations on freedom. If, as Nancy writes, we are born and we die to nothing other than freedom, we share in this freedom with what is not born and what does not die, yet emerges and vanishes. We share in this incandescence of nothingness in which every cause withdraws into the thing. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Georgios. Are there any immediate questions? We have time for a few. If not, Georgios, I have a quick question comment. Earlier, I was surprised to hear somebody mentioned that Nancy maybe can't properly be thought of as a thinker of event in the tradition of Ereignis, which I found quite surprising, because when I read like his writings on birth, on these different avenues that you just took us into, I think this coming to presence is like the thought of Nancy. And I remember in a talk by Marcia Calvante-Schubach, she actually was talking about how through her work with Nancy, she came to translate Dasein in Sein und Zeit as presence, precisely to emphasize this birth in a way. So I'm wondering if you have anything to say about maybe the role of Ereignis event in what you just presented.
Yes, and you're right, Donovan, like there were a lot of people who reflected on this already, and they might have even be better placed than me to answer this question. But as far as I'm concerned, I think that this is the strength, and by the same token, potentially the weakness of Nancy's thought, the fact that he is deeply invested in Genesis and much less invested in structure, if I'm to use this language. And I see Nancy also as a thinker of the event, however, not the event in precisely Badiou's sense, not the event that has kind of a historical but also ontological transformative power, which is unique as a point in an otherwise continuous historical process, right? So that the event is this unique interaction that determines a before and an after. Rather, the way I see this kind of genesis and birth, as you say in Nancy, is as a constant emergence. So that the event is infinitely pluralized. So it is not the event, is events. There is event because there are events in the same way that you would speak of being. So I'd say, yes, he is a thinker of the event, except it's not that one event. That would be my answer.
Thanks. And then maybe Paul, and then Artemi, and then we move on.
Yes, hello, Georgios. Wonderful talk. Very, very difficult. What I wondered was, in fact, the realm of the inorganic is always presented as a realm of necessity. And in fact, if you look back, this is only a recent development, because it's only from Renaissance onwards that we think like that. If you read Aristotle, you have next to nature and techniques, you have spontaneity or just luck. So he distinguishes 4 realms. What would you think is there anything of that ancient way of thinking, that non-modern way of thinking, just echoing in Nancy? It certainly does in Heidegger.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, Paul. I mean, this question is so big and beautiful. One thing I can say is that Plotinus even says that because the world has a soul as a whole, it means that there is this kind of what you also called yesterday nutritive. It kind of corresponds to the world as a whole, to the effect that rocks grow, right? So the life of the cosmos means that obviously the cosmos grows. It's a way of accounting for, and another side thing to that we often think that we from the West exported the spirit to many tribes, anthropologically, they didn't know spirit before, but perhaps what we exported was the body, in the sense of a separation of the spirit from the body. And by that, I mean precisely the idea that there could be body without being a spirit. That would be the dead body, right? There could be potentially a body without a soul. And I see that as kind of, to a great extent, a legacy, not the spiritualization, but really the corporalization of a dead body from the West. And it definitely amplifies with the Renaissance. I think that, yes, Nancy helps us to, I think there is, what I try to pull out, and you're right, it's a very dense talk and it should be spread out over more pages and more time. But what I try to bring out is that there is this ambiguity in the way in which Nancy tries to think the freedom of things. And that I think that life is at the cusp of this negotiation, that life can actually, of course, it would be fairly easy to say that everything that is alive is free. That would be a kind of relatively easy solution. But I think that with Nancy, we can press harder and claim that indeed everything, the stone, is free, and that this has to be thought. And I believe that Nancy can go a long way, as you were saying in previous presentations, with regard to new materialism as well, and so on, going to go a long way to help us think the freedom of the inorganic.
Thank you.
On the event, Nancy has at least one thematic piece, surprise of the event. It's in the being singular plural. And he says there that it's not like the creation, it's more like a singular empty moment that accompanies everything that happens. Like Kant's ego accompanies all our experiences, in the same way this empty event accompanies. So it's quite an original conception based on the finitude. And my question is, in the experience of freedom, he has a chapter, well, half chapter on Sartre, saying that Sartre is wrong because he speaks of causality, and he, Nancy, is real Heideggerian. But when I was listening to you, I really tried to figure out how is that different from Sartre, because Sartre also, in principle, he says that everyone is free all the time, whatever happens.
Yeah.
In fact, we are free because who knows what could have happened, but this happened, and so we are free. Yeah. And the stones are free, but Nancy rightly criticizes him, and then he does the same. Then it's a very formal concept. What is its use? When, of course, liberty and freedom is such an important political concept, and you can distinguish between free people and unfree people, even substantively. And then you say that everyone is free.
Yeah, well, as you know, the criticism there is that Sartre, by understanding ourselves as condemned to freedom, he subjects us, very much like previous thinkers, to a law of freedom. So we are effectively put in a position where, because of the causality of our existence, because we have not chosen, there's a necessity that we confront. And that first order of necessity requires a second response, which is also a necessary response, the response of freedom. We're condemned.
Nothing to do with Sartre, but yes, he says so.
Yeah, well, this is the way that Nancy frames the Sartre's position. And so that second order necessity, the necessity of freedom to respond to the first order necessity, is another form of this redoubled necessity, and that for him is insufficient. There is no first order necessity, and that it calls for not a second order necessity. That's how he thinks. As you're right that Sartre's account is more complex, and I think also those pages in The Experience of Freedom, it could have been longer as well, and a more kind of closer exposition. But Nancy does not think there is a first order necessity to which we correspond then by a compulsion of seeking freedom.